Plato's orthodoxy is in contradiction with Augustine's orthodoxy, which is different than Boethius's orthodoxy. And that's different than Theodore of Seville, who is different from Hugh of St. Victor. Anyone who has some sort of tight-shoed, this is the right way from the tradition, anyone who says that is excluding people from the tradition in however they formulate it.
Welcome to Schlect Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Schlect Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-host today is Mystie Winkler. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. If you are listening to this episode right when it comes out, the big thing you need to know is that our annual fall retreat is coming up next weekend. We have been preparing something super special and we cannot wait to share it with you. We are meditating on the idea of memory and its connection to education. You might even say that this whole retreat is a response to Hugh of St. Victor's assertion that without memory, there is no education. Memory is essential, which means it pays to spend time thinking about it. We hope you join us for a rich feast of ideas and practices on Saturday, October 9th. Go to scholesisters.com/memory to register. Our guest today is Dr. Christopher Schlect. Dr. Schlect has been a Fellow of History at New St. Andrews College for many years, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval civilizations, U.S. history, the history of American Christianity, medieval education, and classical rhetoric, among other subjects. Dr. Schlect is the director of New St. Andrews College's graduate program in Classical and Christian Studies, and also serves classical and Christian schools around the country through his consulting and teacher training activities. Mystie and I cornered Dr. Schlect and demanded an answer to that strangely confounding question, what in the world is a liberal art? What followed was wonderful thoughts on what liberal arts are, what they're for, how to use them, and much encouragement for homeschooling moms like all of us. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholect every day. Mystie, I'll have you go first and set a brilliant example for the rest of us.
Uh-oh. Well, I am reading a book that Abby recommended last year. It was one of her Scholect Everydays last year.
Oh, yeah.
It is The Elements of Eloquence, How to Turn the Perfect English Phrase by Mark Forsyth. So this year for my 5x5 challenge, I had a craft of writing category. And so this one fits in. And it's been great pairing this one while also trying to finish Brothers Karamazov, because when I just don't quite have the emotional energy for that, I can pick this up and read a short, enjoyable chapter. It's fun because he is having fun. And each chapter is on a different rhetorical wordcraft sort of device. And he uses them while he explains them and uses a lot of Shakespeare and poetry as examples. He also uses scripture to illustrate, but he is not a believer and is irreverent when he does so. There's that. So this one, The Blazon, is chapter 5. And he says, when healthy people fall in love, they buy a bunch of flowers or an engagement ring and go do something about it. When poets fall in love, they make a list of their loved ones' body parts and attach similes to them.
That's nice. So true.
And then it has examples. So that's been a fun little book.
I immediately thought of Song of Solomon.
But yes.
I had this professor my Old Testament professor in, I don't remember if it was seminary or if it was my undergraduate, but he put up this picture of what the woman in Song of Solomon would look like if it was literal, and there was like sheep in her mouth and a tower for her neck, and it was great.
If you all start talking about bushels of wheat, then I'm out. It's a little saucy for me.
Well, would you like to go next and get us off the subject?
All right, so a book that I am starting into is called The Power of Money, Coinage and Politics in the Athenian Empire.
Ooh.
It's basically the most prominent treatment to date on Athenian, 5th century BC Athenian monetary policy, which probably tells you as much about me as it does about the book, that I would use a book like that. But there we go. I really get into this stuff, but at my age and experience, I've come to realize that the things that I'm into, not everyone is always into, but I'm into this. So this author recounts the details of Athens' relationship to the other Greek city-states through the lens of monetary policy. And one of the fascinating things that Athens did was issue a decree that required all the satellite nations around the Athenian Empire to discontinue their local currency and use Athenian currency, which I'm really into because I've collected a few ancient Athenian coins. And so I'm learning about my own coin collection as I read this book.
That is really cool. I actually would like to read that book. Believe it or not, I'm interested in monetary theory.
Yeah, you're one of us. Here's my. We're on Zoom here. I'm showing you my Athenian tetradrachma here. This is 20.
Oh wow!
And there's the that's Athena. There's Athena's owl right there. So y'all need to come visit me in my office in Moscow, and I'll let you handle it.
That is actually a much more intact coin than what I saw. My husband and I went to the Getty Villa last week and looked at the collection there. And I mean, most of it is sculpture and not coinage, but a lot of the coins were very beat up. Yours is very impressive.
So they actually let you into the Getty Villa.
They did, but they were frowning at us.
I was at the Getty Villa just 2 weeks before the COVID shutdown, which
wow.
You and I were probably at the Getty Villa like within 2 weeks of its being open, apart from one another.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place. Subject of a lot of interesting lawsuits and repatriating objects back to Italy and such.
Oh, I bet. Well, my Scully every day is The Giver by Lois Lowry, which I actually finished reading aloud to my children about 25 minutes ago. So it was my 4th time through, but my first time reading it aloud to the children. I was waiting for my youngest to get a little bit older where I felt like he could really track with the significance of what was going on. But it was interesting. Even though I've read it a number of times, I had never before caught, I guess, some of the educational overtones in the book. So I don't know. Have either of you read this?
I actually haven't.
You haven't?
I feel.
I have not.
I mean, it's your basic dystopian, trying to be utopian sort of situation. It's not quite Hunger Games. It's not as violent as some of the more modern ones are. I think this one came out in maybe the 80s or something. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, so it's this group of people who have tried to set up a society that's perfect by exerting a large amount of control. And they're striving for what they call sameness. And so everybody being the same, they believe will, basically eliminate all tension and strife if everybody was just the same. So they actually don't see color because, you might see that someone has red hair or blue eyes or something like that. But then also they've even eliminated things like weather or even hills. Like every footpath is straight. There's no bumps. There's nothing to trip up your bicycle, that kind of thing. But what was interesting was this time through, I noticed that the way that they maintained this was through basically utilitarian education. So everyone is trained just in what it takes to maintain sameness. and they're only taught what they need to know. And at the age of 12, they actually go directly into what could only be called tech school, training for their adult job. But they have one person who calls himself the giver. That person is supposed to retain basically all the memories for the community. Those would be memories of real things. He's also the only person allowed to own a library and read books. Everybody else in their family, they call it a family unit, not a real family. But in their family unit, they're only allowed to have about 4 books, and it's like a dictionary so that they can speak very precisely, and just this giant book of rules that they have to follow to live peacefully in the community, that kind of thing. They're all technical books. They're not real books. I shouldn't say real books, but they're not interesting books. So anyway, it's just been fascinating to go through and notice the educational component. Made me think a lot about our recording today, but about utilitarian education at its worst being a way of keeping a people from, in this situation, they don't have wisdom. The committee that runs this community can only competently make decisions about anything that they have faced in the past. For everything else, they have to go to the giver, who's the one educated person, because he's the only one who has wisdom, because he's the only one who has any memory of some circumstance that maybe they could draw on in order to handle the situation. Anyway, it's just a fascinating thing. I think it's technically written for youth, like maybe 12 and up or something. I have always found it a fascinating book. It's a quick read, Misty, if you ever want to do it. It's not, I don't know.
I'm saying that it's a quick read for Misty, but if I want to take it up, it's going to take me a long time to slog through. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, I didn't know if you would want to read it because you were reading on, Athenian money theory. So it's 171 pages and it's not very large. So I recommend it to both of you, but I just didn't know if you made time in your life for YA novels.
No, I tend to make time in my life for harassing people like you. That's what I do.
No. I can take it. That's pretty much my father's hobby. So
that's right. So I'll pick apart anything you say, feign offense, and see what you do with it. That's
it works for me.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. If you've ever found yourself listening to the podcast and wanting to join the conversation, discuss the ideas presented, or ask a question, then join us inside Sistership. That is where we go in depth and extend the conversation to include all of you. We are passionate about reclaiming and pursuing our own education, and we know that real education happens best in community. Sistership is the place to find your sisters. We have a feature that allows you to search for people near you. We want homeschooling moms to connect locally, and Sistership is here to help. We are fond of saying that friends don't let friends read alone, and we have an active and engaged online community if people in your local area haven't joined yet. Together, we read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully the educational philosophy and good and great books. So join today.
Okay, on that note, let's transition to our topical discussion. I actually think this episode was born out of me complaining to Misty that every time I'm reading a book on the liberal arts and they try to actually define a liberal art, I get frustrated because while I don't feel like I can adequately define a liberal art, I feel like the definitions that I read in books that I own, I don't know if they're convoluted or overcomplicating it, or I just never feel clear that I walked away knowing more than I knew before I read the sentence that I didn't understand. So we're hoping that you will straighten us out today, and by extension, our listeners, by helping us understand the liberal arts. And we do mean, exactly what they are and their individual names. But I would love to see us start with what is a liberal art. I think Misty titled this, "What are the liberal arts?" But I want to know what a liberal art is, first of all.
It's important to recognize, and this, I think, goes to the perplexity of the question, is that the liberal arts have been defined in different ways by different voices in the past, and certainly by different voices even today. And so if you're going to define the liberal arts, we have to ask, okay, whose definition are we going to go with? Because there are shades of difference. I would suspect that maybe is why you encounter that perplexity, which I think is pretty understandable. It just means that you're paying attention. The liberal arts, the first time the expression is used, at least in the way that's referring to a sort of curriculum or a program of education, was Cicero, Arte Liberales. And he and other Romans like him, Seneca principally, in one of his letters, wrote about the liberal arts. And the definition that was offered is basically the education that's suitable for a free man. That's where liberales comes in. And a free man, as opposed to someone whose day-to-day routines are engaged in subsistence or provision. If you're a farmer, you're not engaged in liberal arts. If you're an artisan or a craftsman, if you're an engineer, you are not engaged in liberal arts. Those deal with the earthy necessities of life, and the free man is someone who rises above those sort of earthy material necessities of life. That's kind of when the term took its original historic shape. That was the way that it was presented. But it's been variously construed through the ages and its relationship to humanities, its relationship to sciences. Do you have liberal arts and sciences? If you have an expression like arts and sciences, many universities today have colleges of arts and sciences. When you add the term science, are you adding new information? Like, is that two different things that are combined together? Or arts and sciences, do they just go together? And then the humanities, what's the relationship of the term to the humanities? In the last 500 or 600 years, those are some challenges that present themselves when we try to define what we mean.
So Cicero's definition was also before things like the Protestant work ethic.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think that from a Christian standpoint, that notion of liberal arts is highly problematic. When Martin Luther steps in, we see this in his Reformation tract on the freedom of a Christian. And Luther he articulates the idea that we will later refer to as the priesthood of all believers. So Luther will say, the cobbler, the wheelwright, the artisan, the craftsman, they all contribute to the kingdom of God, and we don't relegate them to secondhand status. And so the original formulation of the expression liberal arts arises from a world where there was kind of that denigration to secondhand status if you're working for it. Seneca said, if you're receiving a wage for it, then it's not a liberal art. That's that was one of his key criteria to differentiate, which tells us about that environment. But yeah, I mean, as a confessional Protestant, I'm going to depart from that idea of liberal arts.
Do you have a school of thought that you personally ascribe to and you like their definition the best?
Well, I think Hugh of St. Victor, it offers a formulation that I appreciate. And I think that's the work that we're kind of discussing today. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very good. So in book 3 of his work, this is in chapter 4, in the Jerome Taylor version that's put out by Columbia Press, you'll find it on this great discussion on the bottom of page 88 and extends up on page 89, where he assigns a primacy to what he identifies as the liberal arts, and he calls them the foundation of all learning. And he goes on to say, before all other things are taught, you should teach these. And he identifies the 7 liberal arts. But he characterizes it as the arts that take you to or help you to achieve other arts. In other words, if you study the liberal arts, from here you can go anywhere else. And so this is my distillation. The liberal arts are those arts from which, when studied, you can go study other things, and you're equipped to take on other knowledge.
I remember when I read that section first, what struck me was the end of that section where he says that if only one of these arts be lacking, all the rest cannot make a man into a philosopher.
I was despairing.
I know. I was like, oh, drat, I'm wrong.
Like, I'm pretty weak in astronomy. I don't know.
You are not a philosopher.
That's right. I know.
Yeah, and I think that the way I would characterize it, but I'm taking a page from you when I would put it this way, is that the term liberal arts, in order to kind of catch its historical import, it does liberate you from something. But what it liberates you from is the dictates of another teacher. So, in other words, if you have a command of the liberal arts, then you no longer are subject to someone else's tutelage to order your progress in learning for you. You can now become your own master in learning. This doesn't mean that you no longer have teachers in your life. What I would suggest is what it means is that now, if you have a command of the liberal arts, then every teacher now is at your disposal. Like, you can learn from everyone, and you can do it in a self-directed way rather than being subject to someone else's direction.
Not to get too political, but I do wonder about how especially the last 2 weeks, I've seen a lot of this. The problem is that you guys down here on the social totem pole are not listening to the experts, and you need to just let experts make all the decisions for your life. And I'm wondering if that mentality is the fruit of a non-liberal arts education.
Well, certainly a non-liberal arts mindset, you're absolutely right. It has to do with who's in command of what you know. Are you, as a free person, in command of what you know and what you come to know, or are you subject to someone else's dictate? So it doesn't mean that you're the expert in everything,
right? But
it means that now you're equipped to even marshal the experts and bring them to your service. So
that was one of the things that I loved about Hugh, was the humility that you could learn from, the day laborer in the fields as much as you could learn from a professor at the university. That there was there was a chance for wisdom in every situation, every conversation. I so appreciated that about him.
Right. And that points to another dimension of Hugh. And I certainly agree with that, with the sentiment you just offered. In some presentations of the liberal arts, and we see this even in some medievals, Isidore of Seville's etymologies, I think, tends to organize the world this way, where the liberal arts are coextensive with everything that can be known. So in other words, if it can be known, then there's a liberal art sort of heading that it can be filed under.
Huh.
And I've seen actually classical Christian educators will do things like, well, computer science, that actually falls within, arithmetic or geometry, in the quadrivium somewhere, because we know that the 7 liberal arts represent the full encyclopedia, right? That is not Hugh's view. Hugh differentiates liberal arts from, he has this categorization of different kinds of arts. He talks about theoretical arts, practical arts, mechanical arts, and logical arts. And the liberal arts actually are subsets of 2 of those broader categories. So I think, Brandy, what you were just talking about are the mechanical arts, what Hugh identifies as mechanical arts. And those are important within the domain of human knowledge. And there's something that we need to know and understand. The mechanical arts will include, animal husbandry, agriculture, hunting. He classifies medicine as one of the mechanical arts. These, in his formulation, are the arts that are designed to meet the material bodily needs of humankind. So, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need food. All the arts that are ordered to supplying that need, he says, are mechanical arts, which are not the liberal arts, but they're still important. So this is what I'm saying is interesting about Hugh. Hugh says that there are other things that are important besides the liberal arts.
I love that, because I feel like it keeps us from becoming myopic about what really is, in many ways, our favorite subject here on the show. But it is important to keep it in perspective and to know that it's not the whole world and everything in it.
Right. Which, again, I would differentiate Hugh from some other formulations of the liberal arts where people would again, say that the liberal arts are coextensive with all of human pursuits, Hugh recoils from that. So he said they're fundamental, they're the fundamental starting point, and they have a certain function, but there are other important functions besides what are served by the liberal arts.
So we have 7 liberal arts. But my understanding is we did not always have 7 liberal arts. You would know more about this than I would.
Yes.
Can you explain that part to me?
Yes. Well, the development of the arts into the number 7 is really a development that owes to the influence of Martianus Capella and Cassiodorus. And they were writing on the cusp of the end of the Roman world as we move into the world of Northern Europe, when the Goths were kind of running Italy. That's when these guys were active. And that's when we see the number of the arts codified into 7. So the idea of the liberal arts predates them, but then the effort to sort of enumerate how many there are and to attach labels to them and collect them, like which ones are in the basket of liberal arts and which arts are outside that basket. That's Martianus Capella and Cassiodorus. And they produced 7. Now, of course, they were drawing from things that arose earlier. What we identify as the quadrivium. So these are the mathematical arts: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and harmony or music. Those emerged from before Socrates, from the Pythagorean school. And we read, actually, Plato refers to those in his Republic. And so we've got those 4 arts that emerge from the Pythagoreans. And then running parallel to that, we have the rhetorical tradition. And the rhetoricians are talking about grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And these sort of different tracks wind up ultimately sort of fusing and being collected into one umbrella of 7 liberal arts.
Brandy's sad medicine didn't make the cut.
I really was kind of sad about that, but it's okay.
Well,
I can still study it.
What's interesting is in the history of this, that you talk about the number 7, there are 2 arts, as we get the 7 arts codified into the 7 that we conventionally recognize now. 2 arts in particular, architecture and medicine. There are certain people who included those among the liberal arts, and others obviously excluded them. They thought they were important, but they fall outside of that basket of the liberal arts.
And that's partly because they have more practicality to them.
That's exactly right. And this is that, I would say, that Pythagorean and Platonic strain where, and you see this in those who were all about the quadrivium, where the quadrivium deals with things that are timeless and universal. Whereas if you're dealing with, on the trivium, the linguistic side, it's all about language, so grammar and rhetoric. And of course, there are different languages and they function according to kind of these man-made conventional rules. Rhetoric is always about reading the situation, reading the audience, reading the person to the speaker, and how to systematically work through that. So the linguistic arts of the trivium are definitely earthy and time-bound and situation-bound. And they've always been that sort of fundamentally, whereas the quadrivium, again, deals with these lofty universals that don't touch the ground, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of that lofty universal impulse that renders, that's what's going to inspire some medievals to say that architecture, as important as it may be, it actually has to do with taking geometry, and geometry deals with points which have no breadth or extent, right? And then you have a line which has extent but no breadth. And then a plane which has extent and breadth but no depth, like all of these things that exist in the mind but don't exist in the real world, right? A lot of thinkers would say, well, once you take those geometrical ideas, which are ideals, disembodied, and once you embody them and actually fashion a building, let's say, like what an architect does or an engineer, then you have rendered it into the things of earth, this worldly time and space. You have embodied it, and therefore you've stripped it of its universality. Therefore, architecture, by that chain of reasoning, is not included among the liberal arts.
Well, that makes me feel a little better, because I sort of suspected they were just obsessed with the number 7.
Well, there are some later on. There are some theologians who are going to talk about 7 as the number of perfection and the number of completeness. Therefore, there's got to be 7, no less, no more.
Mm-hmm.
But I would suggest that is that's kind of a post hoc further justification in an effort to dignify the 7.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But you definitely do see that. I think you're going to see that arising in the 11th century. Some people are going to talk that way.
It was interesting to me as you were talking that you said music or harmony. And I sometimes wonder, by calling it music, if we actually lose something, like clarifying that it could be music or harmony, if that somehow enhances our definition of what we're talking about. Can you explain why you used both words?
Well, I use both words because in the literature, especially as you're working from English translations, you're going to see English writers who are translating a Latin harmonia or musica. You're going to see those different English words used for whatever it is they're describing. Music is an interesting, I would say, actually, we're within the realm of the quadrivium here. Both music and geometry have there's some interesting tensions in the history of education about their treatment. Again, going back to the Pythagoreans, music or harmony is what we would identify as music theory. It's all about the mathematical ratios and sine curves and things like that, right? And you're going to see some educators in the Middle Ages who will, when they talk about music, that's what they're talking about. And they would not talk about instruments or choirs, the actual live embodied performance of music.
Interesting.
And there's some places where you would have a monastery that would talk about music, and they're all about music theory, and they would also have a choir, but never the twain would meet.
Wow. Seems unfortunate.
Which is unfortunate. In the history of music education, you're going to see those two poles running. You have the music theory people, and then you have the music, I would say, the practitioner, technician people who, especially in the Christian tradition, you're training up singing and the act of singing. But a lot of the most robust formulations of the liberal arts would say, if you're singing, then that's not the music that the quadrivium is referring to. Because that is particularized, that's actually making a sound in the real world. Whereas the quadrivium is about the timeless ratios.
Interesting.
That's interesting to me, because that almost feels Gnostic or something, like this idea that once you embody the idea, then you've strayed away from the liberal art. I don't know. That's just, I'll have to think about that some more.
Well, and I love your expression, feels Gnostic. If you talk about feeling, then can it be Gnostic? I don't think so.
Touche.
I would go so far as to say it more than feels Gnostic. It's just downright Gnostic. And I think people should be singing. That's
yeah.
So that construction, that you will see that presentation of harmony or music in the tradition, and that's one presentation of it that I would depart from.
So I read a book, and I don't remember what one it is, but it was talking about some sort of relationship between harmony and justice, and I think it was drawing on Plato, and said that he tied the two together.
Yes, you do start to see this, and this is where we do see some interesting tensions within the tradition. But I think that this is very important. I think you're going to see Plato articulate, and not just Plato, but talking about music, they would advocate, yes, you should sing because you're taking these universal principles, the principles of sound with their ratios and their order, which is embedded in the external world, in fact, in the world of ideals. And you are bringing it into your body. Therefore, you are tempering yourself. And to be tempered to control your temper, think about temper as a musical term, is to bring your body into conformity with objective realities. And the Christian thinker who was most prominent in articulating that view, especially putting in a Christian context, is Boethius. Boethius, who wrote treatises on all 7 of the conventional liberal arts. And he develops this idea wonderfully, where ultimately you have the music of the spheres, which is sort of the ultimate divine order. And the music of the spheres wind up being expressed and describable by these geometric patterns and ratios. But then to actually sing, to perform music, is to participate in that divine order and bring your own body into conformity with the external order. And I do think that's a beautiful vision for music.
It's kind of funny to me. If you embody it with sound, you leave the liberal arts. But if you embody it with your life, it's okay.
Well, I think this is where we, honestly, I think we just kind of pick and choose insights from the tradition.
Right. Yeah.
Let's come back to Martin Luther and this reformational insistence upon this worldly embodied faithfulness. I do think that there is an insight about bringing the self into conformity with external reality, which comes from the classical tradition, right? When that's understood within a Christian framework, it becomes this beautiful thing where we understand in Christ the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and Christ in us by his Spirit. And so when we are filled with the Spirit, we will express that in songs and hymns and spiritual songs. I think that tempering ourselves through music is a Christian calling.
I love that.
Yeah, I think just the theory that certainly not all, that I'm down with Boethius, but the theory of the Pythagoreans cannot explain that.
So we have these 7 liberal arts.
Yes.
And
if we're going to go with those 7, yes, then
if we're going to kick out architecture and medicine, then we have 7.
Yep.
How does the existence of these things, this is probably a really big question, but I'm just going to go for it. How does this inform the education, in your opinion, that our listeners are giving? So most of them, the vast majority of them, are homeschooling, at least somewhat classically. And I think this conversation has proven we're all eclectic at the end of the day. But they're mainly dealing with, say, first grade through high school. What to you are the biggest things here? Are these actually subjects that we study? Are they methods? I mean, what is the biggest application?
The first application, I think you already hinted at, which is to just be reassured that you're engaged in a noble work and you're doing the right thing, messy as it is in the trenches. You're just doing faithful work, and don't get overly worried about whether you have the technically right orthodox formulation of this. I've seen educators, and you all inhabit circles that I don't inhabit, maybe you've seen the same thing, where you'll have the classical education orthodox sort of look down their nose at other classical educators for not having the pure classical education.
Yes.
And I think a lot of moms, a lot of brick and mortar classroom teachers can sometimes feel chastened because they can't out footnote the guy who's making that claim.
Right.
And so they'll feel like, well, I'm just offering this limp and lame, shoddy effort because I don't have the pure version of it. I mean, Brandy, earlier you kind of expressed this idea when you read that passage from Hugh and you said,
yes,
well, I'm a schmuck. One of the most important takeaways is to let your hair down a little bit. It's okay. It's okay, because honestly, Plato's orthodoxy is in contradiction with Augustine's orthodoxy, which is different than Boethius's orthodoxy. And that's different than Theodore of Seville, who is different from Hugh of St. Victor. And because I'm an egg-headed college professor guy, I can drop the footnotes. But I can tell you that anyone who has some sort of tight-shoed, this is the right way from the tradition, anyone who says that is excluding people from the tradition in however they formulate it. Because that's how different the voices are within the tradition. So let your hair down. It's okay. I think that's probably one of the most important applications that I could put, is just an application of reassurance, if that makes sense.
Oh, and it is very reassuring. Part of this is just symptomatic of the whole grass is greener. Like, surely someone somewhere is living a better life than I am, right? And even when it comes to education, we do that.
That's right. So when you're going through those, I don't know, the progymnostic exercises or your multiplication tables, and you're sitting there in your at the dining table with your kid wrestling over these sorts of things. Well, God bless you. You're doing great. Anyway, that's one application. And that's, I've studied a fair bit of this, and from a guy who maybe perhaps can drop some of these footnotes. Don't be hounded by people who can drop footnotes that you haven't read. So
that's helpful.
Now, the next application, I think this is probably more true to what you were getting at, is, well, you don't want to fall into the ditch on the other side and say, well, then I can do anything I want to and it's okay.
Right. Yeah.
There is a ditch on that other side. And I think that having a grounding in the history and the tradition rescues us out of, there are some things that you shouldn't do and that sort of thing. And I would come back to that definition of the liberal arts, or that vision for the liberal arts that I offered, which is, these are the arts that free you from the dictates of a teacher. If you pursue these arts, they make you a self-directed learner then. So that if you're teaching your kids the right way, you're actually teaching yourself out of a job, so to speak, so that they won't need you anymore. That's the kind of liberation that you're after by these arts. I do think that oftentimes there's a Hugh of St. Victor. It's actually in the very next chapter from where we were reading. So we're in book 3 as he moves into chapter 5. He distinguishes teaching the art from teaching by means of the art. So you can teach grammar, but you can also teach grammatically. To teach grammar, the art of grammar, its material is nouns and verbs, it's letters, it's phonics, the sounds that words make. It actually extends into metrical feet, iambs and trochees and spondees and meter and things like that. So grammar includes all of those things. You can teach that. And when you teach that, you're teaching grammar. But you don't have to limit yourself to Priscin or Donatus, the grammarians. These are ancients who wrote grammar texts, I'm just mentioning. You can also grab a work of literature, Brandy, like that dystopian novel that you were just describing, and you can teach that grammatically. When you teach that grammatically, you're going to highlight how the author turns phrases, how the author expresses herself, how the author uses word choice, diction, perhaps sound, if the author is using devices of sound. And the material you're working with is not a grammar text. The material you're working with is a dystopian novel. You can teach that grammatically. That distinction is important. No matter what material you're going through, are you teaching this material so that the student is learning how to handle the text that you didn't hand your student, but they've learned the skills about how to handle the text and how to see things in the text that you didn't point out. That's what an educator is aiming at. One day, my student will open a book that I didn't assign. Am I equipping my student today for that day when they open a book that I didn't assign? And am I treating the books that I did assign them in a way that will serve them in that coming day? And that's, nice. I think, what Hugh is getting at by teaching by means of the arts.
So with that teaching grammatically, would that be something like literary analysis?
Yeah, teaching grammatically is a certain form of literary analysis. That's exactly right. And then you can even move on to having the student do an imitative exercise. Okay, so you've read this passage on page 42 of the dystopian novel. Okay, I'm going to have you rewrite that passage in your own voice. Maybe you're going to change. This is a classic progymnostic exercise that I'm suggesting to you, which some of your listeners are probably familiar with. The original passage, this paragraph that maybe is 80 words long, and it's written in third person. I would like you to rewrite it, but I'd like you to rewrite it in first person from the perspective of one of the characters rather than third third person. So there's also a compositional and creative element to it as well. It's not just literary analysis, but it's going beyond that. And then can you construct literature too?
As an aside, I have to say that is probably my favorite exercise. And about 5 years ago, my oldest child, who's now in college, handed me, I can't even remember what book this was from that he was imitating, but he wrote the entire thing from the perspective of a doorknob. It was hilarious because things would pass out of his vision. He couldn't see them anymore.
That's wonderful. And I will tell you that Cicero is looking back from the annals of time, smiling from ear to ear.
I'll have to tell him you said that. That would thrill him.
That's exactly, I think, what Hugh is getting at, though. That's teaching sort of by means of the art. And the art, you want the students to become, might I suggest, like liberal artists. So these are skills, right? And skills need to be practiced. In our culture today, the only people who tend to really understand this well are coaches, people who are coaching basketball teams and football teams. Goodness, if you look at higher education, the one thing we know how to do well is to run a great offense in the SEC. What goes on in the classroom may not be all that great, but man, what goes on the gridiron, they really do that well. and I think there's obviously a disordered loves problem with that.
Right.
But there's also a lesson to be learned, though. If somebody is let's take a basketball coach. The basketball coach understands that in order to prepare the team for the big game, the coach's own virtuosity isn't enough. The coach is going to be there on the sideline. The team is the one who's going to be holding the ball, handling the ball, passing, receiving, shooting, and that sort of thing. They have to be doing it. I think coaches instinctively understand that. They're judged ultimately by the scoreboard. Teachers need to understand that same thing. To be a good teacher is not about my display of virtuosity. To be a good teacher is fostering the skills in the students so that they can do it, which means you need to, and this is oftentimes scary, but you need to let them, if I can shift metaphors, you need to let them take the wheel and drive the car. And that can be pretty scary because they're going to formulate ideas that are hackneyed, underdeveloped. They're going to turn phrases that are not the greatest phrases because they're the ones who are turning those phrases. But I mean, if you've got an 18-year-old who's driving, he will have gone through a regime of having handled the wheel himself with some coaching. You don't just sit there and sit him in a chair and say, I'm going to teach you how to drive.
Right.
What I call that coaching aspect, that's treating whatever it is that you teach as an art rather than teaching it as a bit of knowledge. Students need to be enacting it. Students need to be performing it. And then, of course, you're coaching, you're displaying by example, you're modeling. But the liberal arts, when they're well taught, have the students doing them. They're suiting up for the game.
So in some presentations of the liberal arts, they're presented almost sequentially, like you have to start with grammar and you have to do all of the trivium before you're ready for the quadrivium and you move through them all. How does that fit into the historical development of the arts?
That is a great question. I think that as you look at historically different presentations of the arts, grammar is a prerequisite to dialectic and rhetoric. But the notion that dialectic precedes rhetoric is not sustainable when you look. That idea is current. Dorothy Sayers says it, but you don't find that in history. So grammar does have this foundational level in its relationship to dialectic and rhetoric. But in some formulations like quintillion, you've got everything as rhetoric and grammar is a subset and logic is this subset of rhetoric. They're not, it's just one, it's all rhetoric, and those are just components of rhetoric. When you get to, say, John of Salisbury, who's right, he was a contemporary of Hugh of St. Victor. John of Salisbury thought that it's all logic, and grammar is just one of the subsets of logic, and rhetoric is one of the subsets of logic.
So it's very human to all elevate our favorite part of the subject. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's something basic about grammar. And then in the quadrivium, in some formulations, you'll see that arithmetic also occupies, I would say, an analogously foundational level. So from arithmetic, then you can get to geometry or harmony, music or astronomy, but there's not a prerequisite relationship necessarily between those other three arts of the quadrivium. Now, some authors will present them as though there is a prerequisite relationship, but other authors do not. And it just depends on which author you're going to go to. So, yes, you don't have to teach like, okay, we teach grammar, then we put that away, and then we pull out logic, and then we put that away, and then we go to rhetoric, and then we put that away. That's definitely not the way it's presented. Although you do start with grammar so everyone can read. That's
right. Amen.
That's the one. So Misty asked the question about sequencing. That's the one sequencing insight. But the others are just, it kind of grows from there wherever you go.
That makes so much sense, too. I mean, just because the illiterate man is forever a slave, because he's always at the mercy of someone else to interpret all written work for him. He can never be free. Not really.
Right. And it's also interesting to see what the ancients included within the domain of grammar. Some presentations of grammar include things like tropes and figures, whereas in other formulations, that falls within the domain of rhetoric rather than,
Oh, I could see that, yeah.
So once again, depending on which author in history you point to, you're going to see them even construing these arts a little differently in terms of what their extent and the reach of their domain is.
I'm curious about how the liberal arts then, where does wisdom come into play? Does the acquiring of things like wisdom, knowledge, understanding, is that something that grows up alongside of these arts? Or is it something that's integral to, I don't know, mastering the art or being mastered by the art? I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but how do those things relate?
That's a great and very important question. And I'm glad you brought it up. It's a preoccupation of the writers who talked about the liberal arts too. So I would understand that as the telos. You are, as you teach grammar, as you teach rhetoric, as you teach astronomy, you are ordered to wisdom. And of course, Christ is the wisdom of God. And so that is the end goal. Everything that you teach comes to its fruition in wisdom. So, it's like if you think about the Aristotelian cause of that teleological cause, the end of these things, that's where wisdom fits in. We can come back to Hugh. I mentioned a moment ago about Hugh's basic scheme. Hugh divides the arts, as I said, into four kinds. There are four groupings. There's theoretical arts, practical arts, mechanical arts, and logical arts. The liberal arts, he actually puts liberal arts not in its own file drawer, but he nestles the quadrivium as among the theoretical arts, and the trivium he represents as one of the logical arts. Your question about wisdom can take us to Hugh's general formulation. What Hugh says is that man, of course, fell in the garden, and man then wound up corrupt. And this corruption, it affects everything, and it's the problem that needs to be remedied. That problem arises in various aspects. One of them is arrogance, our pride, our self, our sense of self-sufficiency and self-rule. And the remedy for our pride, Hugh says, is wisdom. And we develop the theoretical arts in order to get wisdom as a correction for our arrogance. But then we're not just arrogant, thinking too highly of ourselves. We also practice bad things. We are beset with vice. Virtue is the remedy for vice. And so he says the practical arts, how we deal with other people, were developed to supply virtue to remedy our need for vice. And then our body is also corrupt. We're on our way to the grave. We need food, clothing, and shelter. For that, the mechanical arts were developed. Those are all about addressing the bodily needs that result from the fall. So those are the theoretical arts, the practical arts, and the mechanical arts. And then Hugh goes on to say we need to reason our way to even sort out all of the above arts. And in order to figure that out, we developed the logical arts.
Wow.
Because we needed some way of coming up with rules and principles to supply our needs. And so we came up with the logical arts. And the logical arts also help us to communicate and teach these arts to other people. And you need all four. You need the theoretical arts in order to get wisdom. You need the practical arts in order to learn virtue. You need the mechanical arts in order to supply your material needs. And you need the logical arts in order to reason about all the other arts and to impart that reason to other people, to share it. And so that's what the purpose of the logical arts are. Back to your question about wisdom, Hugh frames this all as a remedy for the fall. The fall of man is our problem, and we need to repair these ruins. That's a phrase that comes from John Milton. That's how John Milton characterizes it. We're repairing the ruins of the fall. And of course, that's going to be ultimately fulfilled and realized in Christ, who is the wisdom of.
I've had a couple people object to me over that phrase from Milton when I've quoted it, as if I was saying that this was a substitute for Christ's work on the cross. but I felt like, I mean, I don't know what the other alternative would be, even to approach education as if there wasn't a fall. I mean, really what we're saying is there's a fall and it's impacted all of life, and we have to live in light of that. I mean, at least that's how I interpret it. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, no, you're exactly right. And if someone were to say that to me, I would say, so if my child gets sick, rather than giving medicine, I should just have Christ on the cross. Isn't Christ sufficient? If my child is hungry, I should withhold food. Isn't Christ sufficient? So, of course, we know that Christ is the fulfillment of all these things. And apart from Christ, that food you give is not going to bear the kind of fruit that it's designed to. Apart from Christ, that medicine is not going to supply the healing that is designed to. But we do these things in Christ. And so, yes, we are about repairing the ruins, and Christ is all about rebuilding the world and remaking the world. He's the second Adam.
I love that.
Well, it's just the gospel, so there you go.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost going back to Brandy bringing up The Giver and general dystopian literature. Any of those schools of thought are using education as some kind of tool to accomplish an end. There is a problem, and how are you identifying the problem? And then your education is trying to address the problem. But if you incorrectly identify the problem,
Right.
No solutions are going to work.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we know the way the curse plays. God formed man out of the dust of the ground. So the dust is what we're made of. And then when the fall comes, we have enmity between man and his source, the source from which he was made. So now it's only through the sweat of the brow and toil that the earth would be fruitful, right? The earth is designed to be fruitful. And now we have this estrangement between us and the ground. And then there's also the estrangement between man and man, of course, and man being the source of woman, as Eve was made from the rib. Then there's an estrangement also between man and woman. Also, this is all in Genesis 3. But then Christ goes to the grave, and the ground once again becomes fruitful. Christ then emerges from the ground. He is the first fruits. And then we who are in Christ will emerge. And this is just the resurrection hope. You look at the graveyards, knowing that this ground will become fruitful again, and people will form out of the ground yet again, incorruptible.
I think that's
feels like a good place to end, huh? Really.
If we can circle back to one of those points of application, though. So if you are laboring with your child and your child is not really understanding the phonics, the child is not really understanding the civics concept, whatever it is that you might be teaching, know that even in that toil, if Christ is in it, then that's how the world gets remade. With every change of the diaper, as you have your little kid with the big fat pencil in his fist, doing circle after circle after circle, trying to develop the fine motor skills to form letters. That can sound so Ecclesiastes mindless, right? But if Christ is in that, then that's how the world gets remade. And Christ is remaking the world in his image in those kinds of details.
Yes. And not by the education that we are applying being perfectly orthodox and by the book.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, our efforts in and of themselves are imperfect, but it's Christ who actually perfects them. In Christ, they become and are received as perfect works, which is certainly not anything that we deserve. And in ourselves, it's certainly not perfect. You know that. The more that you look to yourself, the more despairing you're going to get about this enterprise. But if Christ is the end of it, then it's all redeemed.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate this, and I think it's going to be of great benefit to our listeners. So thanks for coming today.
Yes, thank you so much.
It's been a delight. I'm really honored that you had me in. So thank you all so much.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS95 to check it out. Remember, our fall retreat is all about memory. Will we cover ideas about memory work? Yes. Will we cover the topic far beyond those narrow bounds? Also yes. Head on over to scolesisters.com/memory to register and prepare to think about memory like never before. In our last episode, I told you that our next episode featured the four of us, me, Misty, Abby, and Pam, chatting about teaching virtue. I was really wrong. This episode with Dr. Schlect needed to come first, but next time it's for real. Is classical education a promise that we will all graduate perfect children? And if it isn't, then why would we ever say virtue is a goal of education? This was such a fun conversation to have, and we look forward to sharing it with you. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Bah.
Oh, yeah, no,
We had it.
well, yeah, so this is that long pause. I presume that you guys are going to edit out there, right?
Yeah, right.
We're actually doing pretty good this time.